All right, let's start talking about this respiratory system. So the reason why we breathe is so that that oxygen can come into the body, into the bloodstream. The bloodstream can carry that oxygen to the individual cells. The cells can take that oxygen up and create ATP. We remember from high school, grade school biology that ATP is the energy currency that your cells actually use in order to perform tasks. And the way that it produces the most ATP is through oxygen synthesis. So, go back to your very first notes in anatomy and physiology and other classes to remind you about ATP synthesis and how carbon dioxide is produced. But that's basically why we breathe on a cellular level. The need to breathe is driven by your need for oxygen and your body's desire to or need to get rid of carbon dioxide. So this is what your respiratory system looks like. You have your nose, which is the beginning of the respiratory system, where you take in the most air. Your nose is your nasal passages. Your nose and nasal passages are lined by mucous membranes that secrete mucus that line the area. And this is what moistens and humidifies the air as you breathe in to bring the air into your lungs. So the air comes in through your nose, it goes through your nasal cavity. If you remember, this is the section where the swab is put into your nose in order to test for COVID because of the mucous membranes and all, the way it's designed. You often, or people will often have bacteria and viruses and stuff that sort of sit in this area. And that is part of the reason why we build up so much mucus and things to get rid of this type of thing, right? The mucus will capture it, and then you'll either get your white blood cells to destroy it, or you just keep producing lots of mucus to dry it out. I'm sorry, to push it out, or a combination of the two. After your nasal cavity, you have your throat, also known as the pharynx. This is how your mouth and your nose are connected through your throat back here. This is why you can drink something and have it come out of your nose, because you have that connection at that location. After your throat or pharynx, you have your larynx, which is your the beginning to your windpipe. That leads to the trachea. The trachea is the part of your windpipe that you can actually feel when you rub your finger up and down the front of your throat. When you feel those bumps down the front of your throat, those are those rings of the trachea. Your trachea will then branch down into bronchi. Your bronchi will get smaller and will become bronchioles, which basically means small bronchi. And that will lead you to your alveoli, which are the smallest unit of the lungs, or the lung sacs. Your upper respiratory tract is considered this area here. So your nose and nasal cavity and your throat. And the lower respiratory tract is your trachea, bronchi, and your lungs. So do know the difference between the upper and lower respiratory tracts. When you look deeper into the anatomy of the lungs, here it says that the air passageways decrease in size but increase in number. So think about the fact that as you go down into the respiratory system, you are moving more into the functional areas of your lung spaces. So your passageways and everything will have to get smaller in order to be able to receive oxygen on a molecular level and exchange carbon dioxide on a molecular level. Have those molecules go in and out of the bloodstream and cross those cellular barriers. Everything has to decrease in size, but there will increase in number so that you have more of these cells to actually help you do this exchange. Remember that your pleura when we talked about tissues at the beginning of A&P1, we talked about pleura as the skin, so to speak, that covers your organs. This in particular is respiratory pleura. So you have two different types of pleura, as with most pleura. You have visceral and parietal. Remember that the word viscera refers to the organs. So visceral pleura is that layer of pleura that is closest to the organ. Your parietal pleura is that layer that is furthest away from the organ. So pleura is a double layered membrane. And you have the parietal membrane that's closer to the body wall, and you have the visceral pleura that's closer to the actual organ itself. Remember, so going back to the trachea, which is the windpipe, it branches off into the bronchioles. You have the primary bronchioles, or bronchus is singular. So these are the very first branches off of the trachea. And then you have your secondary bronchi, which are the next branches off of those primary. So you have primary bronchi, which are you have two of those, one on that goes to each lung. And then your secondary bronchi branch off and lead to the different lobes and the different sections of your bronchi. Tertiary bronchi are even smaller. And then you have your bronchioles, which are the smallest ones that lead to the individual alveoli. Deep to that, or inferior to that, you have your diaphragm. Your diaphragm is the muscle that separates your thoracic cavity from your abdominal cavity. And this is the muscle that actually helps you to breathe by increasing or decreasing the air pressure inside of the lungs. So again, I talked about this in lecture earlier today, but just to remind you, this is representative of the bronchioles. So we've already gone trachea, primary bronchiole, secondary bronchiole, tertiary bronchioles, and then the smallest the primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi. And then that breaks down into the bronchiole. Eole refers to something that's really small, a small version of this. So small bronchi, small arteries. And eule is the same thing. So your venule is your small vein. Okay, so you go down here, the air continues to go down now that it's in the bronchioles. The terminal bronchioles are the last part of your bronchioles before you get to the alveoli sacs, or the alveoli, or the alveolar sacs. And it ends with those alveolar sacs. And each sac is surrounded by capillary network that will be the locations of your gas exchange. Your carbon dioxide will leave the bloodstream and go back into these alveolar sacs. And the oxygen that is inhaled will leave these sacs and go into the capillaries to feed back into your bloodstream. Respiratory system is a bunch of tubes that delivers air to your lung sac. And again, this is where your oxygen and carbon dioxide is exchanged into and out of the blood through diffusion of it out of the blood, as well as through the water that lines the alveoli, and into and out of there so that it can go into and out of the blood. The respiratory and the cardiovascular systems obviously work together, because once the lungs bring the oxygen in, your cardiovascular system is then responsible for taking that oxygen, as delivering it to the rest of the cells, and picking up carbon dioxide from the rest of the cells and delivering it back to the respiratory center so that it can be removed from the body. Together, you can call those the cardiopulmonary system when you're talking about this gas exchange, and how those two systems work as a complementary system, as complementary systems to each other. When you have a disorder of the lungs, it will definitely affect the heart. And when you have a disorder of the heart, it can definitely affect the lungs. We already saw that in the cardiovascular system when you had left or right heart failure, how that can affect the lungs. Specifically, if you have left heart failure, then that can allow the blood to back up into the lungs, where you have then pulmonary edema, where the person starts to have this fluid buildup in the lungs because that part of the heart could not deliver blood to the rest of the to the body. You also have this respiratory and urinary system that will collaborate to regulate your body's acid-base balance. That happens primarily with your oxygen and carbon dioxide levels. If those levels are off, that changes the pH, and that will help you to, your body will then either charge your urinary system to do some things to rebalance the body, or it will change your rate of breathing to manipulate how much oxygen or carbon dioxide is left in the body. Pulmonary ventilation. So when you're talking about pulmonary ventilation, this is another way to talk about or describe the actual act of breathing. A breathing cycle is one inspiration and one expiration. So one inhale, one exhale. That is considered one respiratory cycle. Quiet respiration is what you do at rest. This is your more shallow breathing. You don't have to think about it. It's automatic. It's not deep. It's not forceful. This is just what happens at rest. Your forced respiration. This is when you take in your deep breaths. This is when you're breathing more rapidly. And this is an example of what's going on during exercise when your breathing is increased and more deep. As mentioned before, when you breathe in and you breathe out, you create a pressure difference inside your body with the air that's outside in the atmosphere, or the pressure in your lungs becomes different from what's in the atmosphere. And that actually helps and supports air coming in and out of your lungs. The respiratory muscles are those muscles that actually help you to change your lung volume and help you to create that pressure difference inside your body with respect to what is happening in the atmosphere. Your diaphragm is one of your primary respiratory muscles. This is the muscle that, if you remember, when you look at the thoracic abdominal cavity, the muscle that separates your thoracic cavity from your abdominal cavity. It is the prime mover of respiration. So what happens is that when the diaphragm actually contracts, when it tightens, it becomes flat. When it's resting, it's more of that dome shape. But when it contracts, it flattens. When that happens, that you have the thoracic cavity that enlarges, and that actually pulls air into your lungs. When you relax, the diaphragm relaxes. It develops that, what this is saying, bulge upward, which is that dome shape that is sort of upward toward your lungs, and that helps to compress the lungs themselves to push air out. You have your internal and external intercostal muscles. Inter, remember, means between. Costal refers to the ribs. So the muscles between the ribs. If we were animals, this is the meat that you're eating when you're eating ribs. Your intercostal muscles. There are two layers of them, the internal ones and the external ones. They're side by side, but one is more superficial and the other is more deep. These are synergist muscles to the diaphragm. They are what stiffen the thoracic cage during respiration. It prevents your thoracic cage from caving in when the diaphragm is pulled down toward the abdomen and constricts or flattens. These are the muscles that contribute to your thoracic cage getting larger as well as contracting. This adds about 1/3 of the air that ventilates the lungs. So using your internal and external intercostal muscle helps to add about 1/3 of that air space. You have your scalenes, which are also synergist to diaphragm. Remember, the word synergist means these are things that work together. So scalenes work as synergists to diaphragm, as well as the internal and external intercostals. These scalene muscles help to fix or elevate your first two ribs. They're the ones that actually help to move your first two ribs. Accessory muscles of the respiratory tract mainly act in your forced respiration. So in forced respiration, you have forced inspiration, you have the erectus spinae, the sternocleidomastoid, pectoralis major, pectoralis minor, and the serratus anterior muscles, as well as the scalenes muscles that help you in forced inspiration, that deep inspiration that you do on purpose that's more than your tidal volume. Normal quiet expiration is passive. It's energy saving. Again, this is something that you don't have to think about. Your body kind of automatically does it. And it's achieved by the elasticity of the lungs and the thoracic cage. So for those people who have lost elasticity in their lungs, then they will have a more difficult time with this normal quiet expiration and have to use more of their accessory muscles to actually help them to expire or to breathe out. As the muscle relaxes, these structures recoil to their original shape and size, and this results in the airflow out of the lungs. And again, if your muscles, your lungs have lost elasticity, then they cannot recoil to their original shape. And so you have to use these accessory muscles to actually help you breathe. Forced expiration, the muscles are your rectus abdominis, your internal intercostals, and other lumbar, abdominal, and pelvic muscles. These greatly increase the abdominal pressure. It pushes your viscera. Remember, viscera means organs. So it pushes your organs up toward and against the diaphragm, and that increases the pressure in the thoracic cavity. And this helps to force air out. So if you hear someone talk about abdominal breathing, then abdominal breathing is basically this, where you're taking the contents of the abdomen and using that to help you expire air out of your lungs. The Valsalva maneuver is when you take a deep breath and you hold that deep breath. When you hold a breath, you're holding it because of the glottis that is closing off the windpipe. And then you contract your abdominal muscles against you contract the abdominal muscles. This increases the abdominal pressure because you're still holding in whatever air you have in your lungs. So your abdomen is pushing your organs up, but your lungs are still full. So these two areas are basically pushing against each other, and this is increasing your pressure. This is what happens when you strain to poop, when women give birth and they are like holding their breath to push. When you vomit, the first thing that happens is you inhale and you have that whole increase in pressure. So everything is pushing against everything before you actually vomit. All of that is considered the Valsalva maneuver. And remember, we talked about the Valsalva maneuver when we talked about the digestive system. The more you do the Valsalva maneuver, the more you are increasing your risk of actually developing hemorrhoids, because that internal pressure ends up pushing against and increasing the pressure of the blood vessels that surround the rectum and the anus. So just because you're doing the Valsalva maneuver and it is primarily in your lungs and abdomen, don't think that it's only affecting your lungs and abdomen, because obviously it can help, it can affect other areas of the body. So neural control of breathing. You don't have pacemaker cells in your respiratory system that control your breathing rhythm like you do in your heart, like you do in your digestive system. There is not that central pacemaker location that is there for respiration. They're not really sure how that rhythm of breathing is actually uh, created or maintained, but we do know that breathing depends on repetitive stimulation of skeletal muscles from the brain. And because if you had a spinal cord injury and that spinal cord injury occurred high enough, then you would not be able to breathe. Those breathing muscles will not be stimulated by the nervous system. If you all remember, uh, I can never remember his name when I need to recall it, but he used to play not football. He used to be Superman. So, and I'll find some information and post it, but he used to be Superman, and he was riding a horse one day and somehow got thrown off the horse and he broke his neck, I want to say around C1, C2. So it was very high up his spinal cord. And because of that, he was not able to, he was paraplegic and he was not able to breathe on his own. Luckily, because he is or was who he was, and I guess had finances, insurance, or whatever he was still able to live several years after that accident. They put a breathing machine on him. So the machine actually inhaled and exhaled for him. But he was still alive. But that was an example of this neural control of breathing, how you get that stimulation from your spinal cord. All right. So in the brain, you have three different locations where breathing is controlled. You have two in your medulla oblongata, and you have one in the pons. And both of those locations, both of those are locations in the brain stem. In the medulla, you have your ventral respiratory group, your VRG, and you have your dorsal respiratory group. Remember that ventral is another word for anterior, dorsal is another word for posterior. So the ventral respiratory group is the primary generator of the respiratory rhythm. In your quiet breathing, that quiet respiration, your inspiratory neurons will fire every 2 seconds or so. Your expiratory neurons, which will fire for about 3 seconds, allowing for those inspiratory muscles to relax. This produces a respiratory rhythm about 12 breaths per minute. So that inspiratory neuron firing for 2 seconds and your expiratory neurons firing for 3 seconds, again, will allow about 12 breaths per minute. Your dorsal respiratory group will modify the rate and depth of your breathing. This receives influences from other sources. And then your pons. In the pons, you have the pontine respiratory group, and it modifies the rhythm of your VRG by outputs to both VRG and DRG. This helps to adapt breathing to special circumstances. So when you sleep, when you're exercising, if you're singing, or if you have emotional responses, your pons is going to be responsible for creating that breathing rhythm for those special circumstances. This is a graphic of what your respiratory centers look like. So you have your pons here. So this is the main portion of the brain. This is your brain stem, and this leads into your spinal cord. This is your pons, and this is your medulla in your brain stem. Pons and medulla. And when we go into the nervous system, we'll go more into these locations. Hyperventilation. So hyperventilation is an anxiety triggered breathing state. What happens is because the person starts to breathe so rapidly that your body releases carbon dioxide faster than your body can produce it. Your lungs will release the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere faster than your body can produce it. When that happens, the carbon dioxide level of the blood drops, and so your pH rises. When your pH rises, that will cause the arteries in your brain to constrict. This decreases how much blood is perfusing through your brain, and this can be why you become dizzy or actually faint when you hyperventilate, when you breathe too quickly. This can be brought under control by having the person actually rebreathe carbon dioxide, expired carbon dioxide from a paper bag. So if you've ever seen in the movies where a person was hyperventilating and they gave them a small paper bag to breathe into, that is why that helps. Or that's why they did that, is because they are giving them a place to expire, to exhale into, so that you can capture that carbon dioxide and rebreathe it in so that you can maintain and lower your body's pH levels. Central chemoreceptors. So your central chemoreceptors are the receptors in your brain stem that respond to changes in your pH of the cerebrospinal fluid. So the fluid that surrounds your brain and your spinal cord. The pH of the cerebrospinal fluid reflects the carbon dioxide levels of the blood. And by regulating your respiration, you can again maintain that stable pH. So if you are, if your pH level rises, then your breathing can slow down to help to retain some of that carbon dioxide to lower your pH level, for example. Your peripheral chemoreceptors are located in the carotid and aortic bodies of the large arteries above the heart. And again, they respond to your oxygen and carbon dioxide content or levels and the pH of your blood. Stretch receptors. Stretch receptors are found in your smooth muscles. Remember, your smooth muscles are the ones that are found in, these are the ones that you do not control. They're found in your organs like your bronchi, your bronchioles, and your visceral pleura. These respond to inflation of your lungs. So when your lungs inflate, your lung tissue expands, and your bronchioles, your bronchi, the visceral pleura around your lungs will notice that stretch because of the expansion. And so your stretch receptors will receive that stimulus because they are looking for whether or not you are, these areas are expanding and stretching. Inflation reflex. So this is triggered by an excessive inflation. It's a protective reflex that inhibits the inspiratory neurons and stops inspiration. So if you have too much of this inflation occurring, then your body can slow that down to protect it. And that's called your Herring-Brewer reflex. Irritant receptors. These are nerve endings near and around the epithelial cells of the airways. When you have anything like smoke, dust, pollen, chemical fumes, cold air, excessive mucus in your airways, then these irritant receptors will pick up on that and will trigger a response like bronchoconstriction or shutting down or closing off your bronchi, more shallow breathing. So you're not inhaling any of these irritants deeper into the lungs. You may hold your breath, which is apnea. So PNEA refers to breathing. The A in front of it, responds or means no. So this apnea means no breathing. Earlier we had eupnea, EUPNEA. EU is like good or desired. So eupnea is like your desired breathing, etc. Another protective reflex could be coughing. So if you have these irritants in the airways, your body will trigger a cough to help to expel or get rid of that irritant. And this will be the last one for this lecture, this part of the lecture. Voluntary control of breathing. So voluntary control over your breathing originates in the motor cortex of the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest portion of your brain. The frontal lobe is that lobe or that portion of it that is at the front of your head, just deep to the frontal bone. This portion of your brain is where you have your control of your breathing. This sends impulses down the corticospinal tracts. So meaning the tracts of your nervous system that respond to your respiratory neurons in your spinal cord so that you can actually bypass the brain stem. So if you want to control your own breathing, then you can do so with this part of the brain, and it'll bypass those respiratory centers of the brainstem. So limits to the voluntary control. When your carbon dioxide levels rise to a certain point, then your autonomic or automatic controls will override your own personal controls. So if you hold your breath for too long, if you start to breathe too fast for too long, eventually as your pH levels start to raise or lower, your body will switch from your voluntary control, you doing that on purpose, to that automatic control so that your body can actually maintain your pH. And that's it for this particular video, and we will start with this slide at the next video.